Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Liz Squibb, and I'm a senior associate here at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. You'll hear us use CSSP throughout the event to describe ourselves. I have the pleasure of directing the CARES initiative. CARES stands for Creating Actionable and Real Solutions, and we're a national initiative focused on creating meaningful anti-racist supports for transition-age youth through policy change. Today's virtual discussion is the second of two, and we are excited to have you join us as we explore the CARES initiative and our policy priorities with a focus on the local community agendas that have been developed by and for young people. Over the last 3 years, with generous support from the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, CSSP has worked with a cohort of young leaders from Los Angeles, New York, and Atlanta to reimagine how we support and affirm young people. These young leaders, who identify themselves as CARES ambassadors, have firsthand experience with the systemic barriers and failures of the foster care system, especially for Black, Indigenous, Latina, and youth of color. Rather than focusing on those barriers and failures, the ambassadors worked alongside CSSP staff to identify anti-racist supports that support all young people and their families and communities. CSSP's work within the initiative is about building the ambassadors' capacity to take on leadership roles in shaping policies that affect their lives and the lives of their peers. By centering the voices and the experiences of these young people, CARE is creating a more just and equitable approach to policymaking. The CARES initiative is not just about change, it's about transformation. It goes beyond improving existing systems to envision a future where policy centers on young people's ideas and their freedoms. The ambassadors are building a movement by creating a strong foundation and putting energy and momentum behind turning ideas into action. And today is a perfect example of that. I'm going to hand things off to Leonard Burton, our president and CEO, who will share some reflections on the importance of the CARES approach and the value of co-designing policy with those it will impact. Before I hand things off to Leonard, I just want to say how grateful we are to have him with us today. Leonard is a tireless champion for young people and has dedicated his career to improving systems in the communities that serve them. Leonard?
Thank you, Liz, and thank everyone for being here with us today. I'm happy that you are able to join us in this important conversation about housing that we'll have with our panelists that are here today, our panelists and partners. If you were here with us yesterday, you heard from CARES ambassadors and our partners about the importance of policies around mental health and supports that are responsive and affirming that promote health and well-being and healing. Today, you're going to hear from Kayonda and Elizabeth and from our partners about housing policies that are youth-driven and youth-centered. I want to take a step back for a moment for those of you who weren't here with us yesterday for our conversation around mental health and say a few words about CARES, creating actionable and real solutions, and why this work is so important. I'm really appreciative of the partnership and the resources that we receive from the Conrad Hilton Foundation that helps us to lead this work at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. CARES recognizes the power and promise of young people. As Liz said, we have been working with CARES ambassadors, about 27 across the country. When I say across the country, I mean in 3 specific jurisdictions: Atlanta, Los Angeles, and New York City, with young adults who have experience in the foster care system, experienced and impacted by the foster care system. The work is to reimagine a society that supports young people and advance youth-centered and youth-driven policies. And when we talk about reimagining a society that supports young people and youth-centered and youth-driven policies, we want to step back from the boxes that we've operated in, assuming that all the work that young people need who've been impacted by the foster care system needs to happen within these deep end public systems like child welfare. Together with CSSP staff, CARES ambassadors have co-designed both a national policy agenda and local policy agendas that would create the conditions in community for young people to be supported, affirmed, and included. Many of you know from your own work and understand, and as just a person in these United States, that housing is, there's a crisis in housing in America. We've all seen how young people, families have been disrupted and come into foster care as a result of poor housing options. But yet we're holding families accountable for a failed issue in our society. At CSSP, this co-creation with young people is core to our mission and an approach that we're deeply committed to advancing policy solutions alongside young people so that young people, other families aren't disrupted by this crisis, the societal crisis, and being held accountable for failure in public policy around housing. So today we're going to hear about housing policy care agendas that the ambassadors in Los Angeles and New York co-design with the CSSP staff. In both Los Angeles and New York, young people face significant barriers to affordable, stable housing with high rents, limited assistance, and a complex system making it difficult for many to secure a safe place to live. So we see that in Los Angeles and New York, but we also see that around the country in rural communities as well. So you have that in both urban and rural settings. There is a crisis of housing in America, and our young people who are impacted, who are in part of these child welfare systems, they receive even more. The impact on them is even more grave. We don't want to have the young people live in this space that they're what they need, how they need it, and where they need it. So for young people, housing is a basic need and essential for successful transition to adulthood. And it's incumbent upon us who care about young people, who care about our society, that we help create the public policies and advocate for the right resources that young people need to be successful. Safe and stable housing promotes health and well-being and supports young people as they pursue education, employment, and other goals. As you have safe and stable housing, it also helps you to have family autonomy, for your family to be able to decide where you want to live, what neighborhoods you want to be a part of, what communities you want to be a part of. But we need to create public policies and practices that allow you to make those decisions. I'm looking forward to today's conversation and thinking collectively about how we can create and realize the vision that CARE's ambassadors have put forward, a vision for housing that respects their independence and provides affordable, reliable housing in safe communities, particularly for young people aging out of foster care, impacted by foster care, and Black and Brown young people around the country. Thank you for being with us today in this space and for this conversation. I look forward to continuing to partner with each of you as we move forward with this work. Liz, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Leonard. Appreciate all the words of wisdom that you always bring and the leadership that you give us. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have an incredible group of experts with us today who will share their perspectives on housing. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, share their roles in organizations, and reflect on what housing means to them when they think about the needs of young people, and more importantly, why it matters. I would encourage each of you to do the same in the chat. We also have a Q&A option where if you have specific questions, we'll be gathering those and preparing them for the Q&A that will happen at the end of the session. But we want to hear from you. So let us know, when you think about housing, what are the needs of young people and why does it matter? Let's start with introductions with my colleague.
Hey everybody, Alex Citron here, she, her pronouns. I'm a senior associate at CSSP. So happy to be here with you all today. At CSSP, I lead and manage our family autonomy and child welfare policy portfolio. And when I think of housing, I really think of a home. A home provides a stable, a secure base, a place where a young person can feel safe and comfortable, and where they're connected to the community where they choose to live. This community is really important to all of us when we think about our housing and our home. So I'm going to pass it to Michael, who's joining us today. Michael?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. Again, I'm Michael Santos. I'm the Associate Director of Results Educational Fund. We're a grassroots lobbying organization who works with Congress to create the political will to end poverty. I'm also the current chair of the American Bar Association Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and did a lot of youth justice work in my early years as a staff attorney in California. I think for me, just reflecting on this question about like what does housing for young people mean and what I think about it, going back to what Leonard was saying earlier, I see it as an issue of choice, right? When I my work and my own lived experience living and growing up in poverty, I feel like I did not have a lot of choices. The choices were really that were made available to me were dictated by the policies, programs, and supports that are available to families, to young people, and all of this to say, right, like the choice to live in a neighborhood where you feel like you can thrive, choice in a neighborhood you can live, to be close to school or to work, or to have access to a lot of resources and supports. And so I'm very much looking forward to this discussion today with the other co-panelists and with the rest of the group here, and happy to be in collaboration with CSSP. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to see you here all today, and I appreciate your participation in this panel discussion. My name is Elizabeth Villa, and I proudly bring to you 3 to 4 years of experience with the CARES initiative. And when I think about housing and how that matters to a lot of young people have the right to safe, stable, and healthy and affordable housing that meets their unique needs. Many are successfully embracing their roles as parents or students or actively working towards stability and healing in their lives. They are determined to create a better future for themselves and their families. Speaking from experience, I am a mother, a student, also continuously always looking for resources and making an effort to support my community in any way I can. So yeah, and with that, I'll pass it over to Jenny.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Pokempner from the Youth Law Center. I use she, her pronouns. I do policy advocacy at YLC focused on older youth in and leaving the child welfare and juvenile justice system. And I agree with all the panelists about the importance of housing, in addition to thinking of really relying on it for safety and security. Also, I think see housing as a foundation, a place from which youth can live their lives, make choices, as Michael said, and also plan for the future. And I really love the framing that the CARES ambassadors present, or the goal of having housing as a guarantee for young people. So appreciate that. And I'll pass it to Cara.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be with everyone. I'm Cara Baldari with First Focus on Children. We're a national children's advocacy organization, and I do policy advocacy in the areas of family economics, housing, and homelessness policy. I use she, her pronouns. And I echo what everyone has said so far. And I think, housing that is truly affordable, right? So that young people can build savings at the same time and have that good foundation, and housing that gives them a sense of agency and independence and like Michael said, ability to make choices. So I look forward to our discussion, and I'll pass it to Kayonda.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Kayonda, and I've been with CARES for 3 years, and I'm also an advocate counselor with Good Shepherd. And just to piggyback on what everybody else said, when I think about the needs of young people in housing, I think about affordability, community, and also safety and support services. So as a whole, I think the housing needs of young people is essential for the development and the health of the society as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayonda. I appreciate appreciate the panelists for those powerful reflections. Part of what we're going to do today is go just a little bit deeper. We're going to think about the perspectives, just to set the stage. Then we're going to talk about a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about the actual agendas, and then we're going to have some time for Q&A. But to dig in just a little bit deeper, for reflections to hearing your perspectives, let's start with the ambassadors with a question about housing. When it comes to housing, what are the greatest challenges that young people and transition age youth face? Let's start with Kayonda.
Hi guys, again, I just spoke. But so for me, what I think is a challenge is access and support for identifying safe and stable housing as young people transition out of foster care. And I'll pass it on to Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you, Kayonda. As Kayonda said, current and former foster youth and young adults have harder time accessing resources and navigational tools to support housing. The lack of affordable housing is a challenge we're currently facing. The challenges range from limited resources, financial needs, to barriers to accessing the necessary tools, often compounded by mental health issues, which this matters because without a sense of direction, young adults are vulnerable to becoming homeless and continue a cycle of instability. So as we've heard from many discussions, we feel like there is a lot of barriers within resources, but yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks for setting the stage for your perspectives. I'd like to move to the partners' perspectives now. When we think about housing, what should housing policy do? I mean, what is needed in policy to be responsive, as Elizabeth said, to the needs of young people, both broadly and perhaps in New York or LA? Could we start with Cara?
Sure. I mean, I could speak to, more broadly is I think the housing system really needs to work for a wide range of people who are in a wide range of situations. And we need to really be innovative in our thinking of how we can deliver safe and affordable housing. And, I think young people are too often falling through the cracks, right? Because they might be in situations where our systems aren't always set up to serve them. So, for example, if you have, a lot of young people who are in these kind of doubled up situations and moving around a lot, right? They, the voucher system might not be set up to always serve them as easily. And we know, there's long wait lists and not enough investment. And, if they're not a traditional tenant, right, what does that mean if they need to access emergency rental assistance, right? And then at the same time, they might not be considered homeless, right, by the kind of narrow definition that the US Department of Housing and Urban Development uses. So if they're going to need that, emergency services, and we know often young people might not, be in a shelter or on the street if they are experiencing homelessness, but that doesn't mean their needs are any less. And so I think highlighting that for lawmakers, and, that's why the youth voice is so important, right? Because I think lawmakers need to understand how these systems are playing out on the ground, and then, how young people are falling through the cracks.
Thank you. Michael, Jenny?
I can go next. I think for me, it's really just like having a comprehensive solution to housing policy, right? And this is coming from understanding that young people have diverse housing needs in the country, across the country. And whether you're like, leaving a system of care, the child welfare system, the criminal justice system, or the juvenile justice system, or if you're in college or you're already part of the workforce and you're working, right? And I think, piggybacking from what Cara was saying, lawmakers really need to listen, integrate, and center voices and input of young people with lived experience, because these are the people who actually know what policies are needed on the ground to really truly meet the needs, the housing needs of young people. And I think more importantly, we also just need the political will, which is also needed to unlocking more funding and resources needed. And I think going back to what I had said earlier, right, we also need to look at housing for young people and how that intersects with other issues, because it's not like we're past this point where it's like where you're not just looking at housing anymore. And that seems to be what's kind of being uplifted in the CARES recommendations from New York and Los Angeles groups, right? Is that it's not just like your brick and mortar housing, it often involves other issues that often intersect and overlap with housing, whether that's like economic security or understanding the transportation needs and being close to work if you're actually part of the workforce or you're trying to get a job or retain a job. All of this to say that I think, we can also talk about like how this intersects with taxes and racial equity, fair housing, and making sure that people, we don't create pockets of neighborhoods of poverty and really integrate people with different housing needs and different income brackets across a neighborhood. So those are my initial thoughts, but I can pass it on to Jenny.
Thanks. And I agree with all the panelists, and would just add that in kind of complementing the idea of, making sure we're hearing from youth, is that what I think policy really does not take into account, although we're seeing some changes, is just this unique needs that youth who are in that emerging adulthood age group of kind of 17 to mid 20s. And the CARES report does a great job of really identifying what are some of the things that are very typical for someone at that age when they're entering the housing market, and then adding the layer of what if you are that age and you are impacted by a system and might have less support, or have a different response to how support is provided because of the history in the system. And again, I think we're going to hear, and we see in the chat, like some good examples of programs that have taken that into account, but we definitely need more of that to make sure that we do kind of have, in a more systematic way, policies that respond and are tailored to those unique needs. And I think, again, building on what all the panelists said, is we're starting to see more programs that are really thinking about not just providing housing, but also helping people, build their assets, have more choices, whether it's making sure in programs that have rental subsidies that when you earn more money, that doesn't raise your rent. So we'll talk, I think, about like the family self-sufficiency program, which does allow individuals to, when they increase their income, to put that in escrow and save that rather than being penalized for earning more money. And I like that example, but think we can replicate that in a lot of different ways to, again, think about housing as a real important foundation and base, but also think about what the young person and any individual's like next steps and trajectory are, what their life goals are, what they want to build.
Yeah, I think, Jenny, those are really good examples of how we're thinking about the diverse and holistic ways that housing needs to be supporting young people, minimizing barrier and supporting their autonomy, right? And their choice, their ability to make their choices and pursue their goals as they want. The other thing that I just want to echo off of what Michael was saying is around how does housing policy support creating communities where we can actually go and borrow a cup of sugar? We were just talking about, as the panelists were gathering beforehand, what do you do when you have when the drain is clogged, right? Asking your neighbors for help. As a parent myself, like Elizabeth, can somebody come and watch the monitor while my child sleeps so I can go out and get some more milk or some toilet paper, right? How does housing policy really support young people in this way of creating supportive communities?
Thank you, Alex. That's exactly right. I want to stay with you all. We get the double pleasure of having Alex as both a facilitator later and a panelist now. So stay with us. Jenny, Michael, Cara, Alex, could you share what we're getting right with policy? And I'm going to follow with a question to the ambassadors about where we see gaps, but let's start with, when it comes to housing, what are we getting right?
I'll hop in as ending the last one, starting this one off. I think we're getting right at signaling that young people matter. Young people matter, and we now are recognizing, and it's really, I can't even believe I have to say this, right? That we recognize that dropping young people off at homeless shelters when they age out of care, it's unacceptable. We know it still happens, but there is now a recognition that that is unacceptable. And across housing policy, we now see that young people matter. We've seen this with the foster youth to independence vouchers, prioritizing young people aging out of care in the family unification program. So we know that young people matter, and I think that's one place where we're starting to get things right. And I'll hold to hear from our ambassadors around where there are still gaps that we all know. But let me pass it. I'll pass it back to Jenny on what else we're getting right.
Yeah, and I would definitely want to highlight, and I'm not sure if they're in the audience, but FYI, foster youth Fostering Youth to Independence program was really, we have it because of you, young people advocates at Action Ohio, really led, along with a lot of us, probably all of us know Ruthie White at the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare. And they really did the advocacy to say young people do need a targeted and tailored program. And we definitely know, and I know the CARES report provides a lot of details about how implementation still is struggling. Although, again, I think we're seeing a lot of positive moves, but we need more. But that program did a couple of things that I think are key elements of what we need. It doesn't require young people to become homeless to access housing assistance. That's not required. You can be planning to enter the FYI program. You can, if you don't have another housing option. And certainly it shouldn't be the only housing option, but at least as a structure, it is structured so you can enter the program in a planful way and not because you become homeless. It also does allow jurisdictions to access those vouchers pretty quickly. This language of on demand, which I think is really important. And then the family self-sufficiency program to allow young people to save. And it's available, of course, to all voucher holders, or if the housing authority has that, but definitely so important for young people who are really building their assets. Another real, I think, model or bright spot to look at is more jurisdictions investing in housing that is connected to community college. And this could also be connected to four-year schools. It's just we've seen more of a push, and many community colleges don't have housing. But it has been really exciting to see jurisdictions that have done that, and they do kind of present a vision that I think is similar to what you all present in CARES, but you, Kayonda and Elizabeth, let me know if you feel this is accurate. They present a vision of housing as something like education that young people should have access to, as just a matter of course, that it's something that young people should be able to rely on, and also something that the community benefits from when young people have. And so starting to see some of those developments, I think are exciting because they are kind of trying to build the housing within the community, but also really make it, again, something that it is understandable. It is perfectly normal for a young person that age to need stable housing. And I think we're also seeing exciting examples similar to what other people have talked about so far in terms of positives of like housing that's embedded in the community, housing that maybe on the first floor has, you know, community resources, particularly that are targeted at young people at that age, but don't just keep them within the housing complex itself, but kind of attempt to connect young people to their communities. And I'll pass it back, if we're going reverse order, back to Michael.
Okay, yeah. So I think for me, it's good that we're paying attention to the housing needs of young people, and there seems to be a growing chorus of advocacy and discussions around the housing needs of young people, not just within, you know, this group, but like in the broader housing advocacy movement. And glad to see that there is momentum to that. And I think the question is, right, like the big question is like, how do we keep that momentum? Because working on federal housing policy in particular with like targeting the needs of young people, it ebbs and flows, right? And I think that's the question that I'm trying to address. Like, how can we sustain the momentum and push for more advocacy around addressing the needs of housing needs of young people? I'm also really delighted to be seeing a lot of recommendations coming from the state, like the local city and state level, because housing has always been traditionally been a local and state issue. And so it's really, really helpful to be hearing from these communities in New York and Los Angeles, just so that we can get a better picture of a granular picture of what's happening in these local communities and what exactly is needed. So the question for me is like, how do we layer that on top of like existing ongoing advocacy on the federal level, in addition to what's already happening on the state and local levels? I'm also just glad to see a lot of participation from young people. And again, just echoing that we need to hear more from young people. And it's not just, it's not just me, it's not just like us, but more voices, more new voices to really provide a more nuanced understanding of what the housing needs are for young people. Because even though we're talking about the housing needs of young people, it's actually really diverse, whether you're looking at it from different population or demographics, right? Like if you're a person with disability, or if you identify as LGBTQ, these groups also these young people have different housing needs that again need to be addressed through a comprehensive housing policy. And on that note, I think people are starting to pay attention and really introduce like legislation and bills that really hit on how housing intersects with all these other issues that we've been talking about, whether that's like tax law, childcare, healthcare, racial justice, right? And it's starting to really bleed into all these other issues, which I think is great. And I'm all for it, right? Because that's really what needs to happen, right? Because housing is fundamental in needing, and helping people thrive, whether that's like being able to keep a job, being able to stay housed, like not coming into contact with the criminal justice or the child welfare system in the first place. One thing I would say too is I think increasing supply is a good thing, right? And we're hearing a lot of that discussion in Congress, and the campaign trail during the election season. Again, that's a good thing, and happy that that is getting some bipartisan support. But we also need to address the demand. And going back to what Cara said earlier, right? Like it's a question of we can build more affordable housing, but affordable to whom? And are young people actually being able to access these affordable housing? And what are we doing to address the housing burdens, the cost burdens of young people who need help now, right? Because increasing the supply is more of a long-term policy goal, and that's not going to be felt like for 5-10 years to come, even longer. And again, I'm just delighted to see ongoing efforts to fold people with lived experience into policy making and policy decisions. I think that's a step in the right direction, but obviously we have a lot of work to do there as well. I'm going to pass it back to Cara.
Yeah, I'll just quickly build on what everyone else said, is that I think there is an increasing awareness more broadly among lawmakers about the lack of affordable housing, and for renters in particular. I think the outbreak of COVID-19 really illuminated that, right? Because what does it mean to not have access to stable housing and not be in an overcrowded situation, right, when there's a global pandemic going on? And so I think that has helped, and we are seeing, I think, more ways that the federal government is trying to incorporate, young people's voices in that. For example, I just saw that the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness has a youth council, right? And so, there's signs, right, that there's recognition, of course, not enough, and and we need to increase that accountability. But I think those are all good signs. And then, and speaking more to the idea of being innovative, I think, we've seen some signs that there's interest in innovative ways to deliver housing assistance. I think if we can make that more vouchers work for more people, great, right? But that, what can cash assistance do to help for housing instability? Is that the form? And I think we might talk more about this later and talking about solutions, but could we have a national renters tax credit, right? Could HUD is looking at supporting pilots that would deliver direct rental assistance to folks. So, there's all kind of, I think, bigger thinking, more innovative thinking that's going on, which I find encouraging, but of course more is needed.
Thank you so much for those. Let's stay there. Let's shift just a little bit. I'd like to talk about the gaps, and I want to start with our ambassadors. But Elizabeth, Kayonda, as you think about gaps, challenges, what are the specific challenges for transition age youth? And if you can specifically, what are those challenges looking like in Los Angeles? What are those looking like in New York for you and your peers? Elizabeth, you want to take first? Oh, I'm sorry, Kayonda, you were ready to go.
I mean, for me, like I'm gonna go based off my experience and what I think that Adifa are dealing with. I'll say neighborhood disparities. So some neighborhoods may lack opportunities, amenities, and suitable housing. So I live like 15 minutes away from the subway station, so I have to get up extra early just so I could be to catch my train. And then like supermarkets, I have to get Uber just to go to the grocery store. So I'm not near anything, so it's hard. And then like when I first tried to get my housing, like it caused me a lot of stress because I'm trying to get everything together, but also trying to figure out where I'm going to sleep at night, you know? So it was just like a whole mental health crisis. And then also like financially, like they want security deposits, they want broker's fees, they want all these documents. And it's like, I don't have a job. So how am I providing pay stubs and things like that to even get, you know, my housing? Like they need all this stuff to even approve you. So it's just like a whole obstacle that we have to go through. And it's just like, it's overwhelming and it's hard, you know? So we got to do better, you know? Like, I'll pass it to Elizabeth.
Yeah, adding to what Kayonda shared, young people are facing significant challenges in accessing affordable housing. Many struggle to meet the necessary requirements for programs like subsidized housing, Section 8, access to housing vouchers, and often find themselves unable to secure a spot in a waiting list. This issue is compounded by the constant change in caseworkers, which leaves them without support or guidance they need to navigate the system effectively. It is crucial to address these barriers that ensure that young people have stability and opportunities they deserve, such as renter's history, credit history, access to resources, and also keeping in mind that there is limited income, bank statements, which a lot of young people don't have the required bank statements that are required for like 3 to 4 months, and showing account balances. To be realistic, a lot of young people are not making enough. And when you're showcasing that on your bank statement, could be very overwhelming because it's like sometimes you have to dig into savings. Sometimes you're not saving how you're supposed to due to the fact that you could be a parent, you can be a student, you're not making enough. And as well as following with that with co-signers. A lot of us young people do not have people that we rely or trust enough to be a co-signer. Or some of us do not want to put that burden on other people of being a co-signer. Who knows, we might have hard times and unable to pay certain bills, and we wouldn't want a co-signer to have that fall for us. Another thing would be the support and the guidance through the process of applying for housing, whether it's subsidized housing, Section 8 housing, or just independent housing. And as well as renters insurance, something that we don't hear about or educate young people is renters insurance. What does that look like? What does that mean? And how much is that adding to your bill? Like being realistic, like you're already paying for water, gas, electricity, and then renters insurance, which adds. And lastly, consideration for families with young children, including safe and potential bias, support from including safe housing and potential bias. So what this means is that a lot of young people with children encounter a lot of bias. There's a lot of discrimination behind that we potentially see a lot just because of being a young parent. They put it in their head that you're not going to be responsible, your kids might be disrupted or something like that, which I've encountered in the past. If I go apply for they'll be telling me like, oh, there's something upstairs, but we don't really trust parents with children upstairs either, whether it's because we don't want any noise or anything that could disrupt the tenants that live out there already. But yeah, those are some of the things that we're currently seeing in LA. But yeah, with that, I'll pass it to Alex to talk a little bit further in this situation.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in here and kick off sort of what else we're seeing in the partners. I mean, I think Kayonda and Elizabeth really have named it, and we've heard from the partner panelists as well, right? At the core, getting housing is not easy. There are hoops to jump through, financial barriers, broker's fee, upfront costs, having to find somebody to sign for you, right? It's difficult. There's a lack of available housing, affordable housing. It's not convenient. It's not in the communities where folks are looking. And what we've seen is that in New York, it's not only hard to find, but in 2022, I just want to drop a couple data points here. In 2022, the median rent in the city was equivalent to almost 40% of the income for New Yorkers age 25. And across LA County, nearly 2/3 of unhoused young people attribute their lack of housing to economic hardship. And in the city, among young people ages 18 to 25, medium rent alone claims 46% of their income, right? So it's an incredible cost. And even if you can access housing, housing vouchers can defray some rental costs, but young people living in LA contend with 20 different public housing authorities in the county, long wait lists, and limitations on how they can use their vouchers. We've heard of solutions that New York City has come up with, city-specific vouchers, but what about for those young people who want to move out of the city? Still can't take that voucher with you. So even if one does secure housing on their own, which is a feat of its own, those vouchers don't travel with you. So we're seeing a lot of limitations and challenges, just echoing what Elizabeth and Kayonda have said. And I'll pause there to see if other panelists want to jump in.
I mean, I'll just jump in to say that, I think just overall, we are not investing enough, right? And with, for families with children or young people on their own, First Focus, we do a children's budget book every year, right? We analyze federal spending. And, that's including for programs serving young people over 18. And, unfortunately, spending right on children and youth is declining. We saw a little bit of an uptick rate in reaction to COVID-19, but that money is gone. And so it's easy for lawmakers, right, to say they care, but then they're not actually making the investments, right, when it comes to the budget. And of course, that filters down to then, how public housing authorities can get people off the wait list. I read a stat recently that I think 40% of housing vouchers are returned because folks are unable to use them, right? So that really shows, what else we need to be doing. And I think, in many places there's supposed to be legal protections against discrimination, right? For folks with children or young people, but those are not enforced. I think increasing access to legal aid and resources that could help young people navigate the system is all needed and needs to be included when we make these investments, right? So the money's helpful, but it's not enough, right, if it's not accompanied by these other things. I know there's been federal funding for like landlord outreach, for example. I think more of that is certainly needed to get more landlords to take vouchers. And then what can be created in places maybe where there's a office for tenant advocates, right? Could there be somebody specifically tasked to help young people? So I think there's a lot we could do that should be attached to any investments we're making. And the advocacy that you're all doing, I think is really critical to that. So I'll see if any of my other panelists want to jump in.
Alex, I was just going to add that there are flexibilities that HUD does give jurisdictions, like particularly in the area of, I think the term they use is portability, the ability to take the voucher to another jurisdiction. And, there are definitely rules that housing authorities have the discretion to make. But there's also, I think we've seen particularly some movement in Los Angeles. One of our fellow advocates, Dexter O'Connell from Safe Place for Youth, has been really trying to work to get housing authorities to do some of those reciprocity agreements so that a young person could take a voucher to another part. Even, Elizabeth knows the best how large and diverse LA is, and it does have many housing authorities, which is a little unique, although not totally unusual for a state to have like more than one. But definitely LA presents that complexity of, I think, 17 to 20 housing authorities. So being able to move and use your voucher is really critical. But those are things that like we do need then housing authorities to work together. We need advocates to kind of push housing authorities to make some of these agreements. And it's not going to solve all of the problems, but it's just like a lot of the policies we see, from the federal to state level, there isn't like all this discretion. I can't say there's a huge amount, but there are a lot of little places where, we're maybe told this is how it happens, and where you do need to kind of look into the rules. And like I said, often we do rely on the guru Ruthie White to say, is this really what's, this is what we're being told from a housing authority? Is that how it has to be? And sometimes the answer is no, like there's some flexibility, it's going to need some advocacy. And of course that is challenging, but it's just to say that might give us some, thoughts about not only the local advocacy, but then kind of going back to the HUD and saying, can you provide more direction to housing authorities on this? Can you maybe provide more prescription so that there is more of that flexibility, and that you don't have to, again, kind of spend all this time trying to do something that does make sense? I do think we're seeing more policies from HUD that are attempting to do that, but obviously that's, it's a big bureaucracy, things work slow. So the areas I think we want to push on, we do really need to highlight.
Michael, we've got a few minutes if you want to jump in. Otherwise, I'll move us to the next part of our work here.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, I was having
Yeah.
trouble unmuting. I'm not exactly sure what's happening. I think echoing what what everyone else had said, and I think just wearing my hat at Results, really thinking about the lack of political will, and I guess like putting more nuance to that lack of consistent political will, right? Because again, the interest in providing and meeting the housing needs of young people ebbs and flows, especially if you look at it from the federal level. When you're working with Congress, we do have some champions on the Hill, lawmakers, and the administration is somewhat paying attention to the housing needs of young people among other populations, among other groups, among other issues. But it really should be a nonpartisan issue, and it should stay that way. We also need to address, I think, this concept of housing choice, what Jenny was saying, what Cara was saying around portability, right? And when you're looking at these metropolitan areas like Los Angeles and New York, I mean, Los Angeles, I live in both cities. In Los Angeles, we have a transit system, but also most people drive. Like some people a lot of people use the bus system. Some people use the trains, but most people drive. In New York, there's a lot of transportation infrastructure already built in place. But I think there's like different boroughs, and again, different, just people wanting to live in different areas of the city could present some challenges, and how you can actually like relocate or be close to like school or to work. And really thinking about this from the housing choice perspective, right? Like, because when you're in survival mode, like when you're living in poverty, at least this was my experience, right? You're on the verge of homelessness, you're losing your housing, you just don't have many options available. You don't have the time or luxury to be advocating. You're just trying to hustle and stay housed and get to work. Like that is the reality of many young people, like living day to day. The other point I wanted to make is like stronger enforcement and implementation mechanism for existing protections. I think it was Kayonda who talked about, childcare and being discriminated if you have families or kids. Like these, there are already existing housing protections, and some communities already have discriminate protections against discrimination from housing choice voucher holders, right? And we need to beef up the enforcement of those protections to truly help meet the needs of young people, so that they're also not discriminated in the housing market. And lastly, I'd say, and I think this was echoed in some of the recommendations by both groups, is like better outreach and education. I had the privilege of working with young people and navigate like PHAs, public housing agencies. And let me tell you, like a Section 8 voucher, like the voucher program, the book called the admin handbook, it's at least 200 pages long. right? And there's just so many rules, so many requirements, and missing one or two could literally jeopardize your housing stability, right? And that's what I've seen as an eviction defender when I was a community lawyer in San Francisco in the Bay Area. I worked with public housing tenants and Section 8 voucher holders, some of whom are young people. Some have got out of the foster or getting out of the foster care system, and it's really challenging. And one of the issues is like, yeah, I just missed that rule, or did not recertify my income on time, or just did not follow the rules that the public housing agency had put together. And I know there are already existing supports there, but really trying to understand like, how can we improve outreach and education for young people, especially young people who are like just busy trying to survive.
That's right, Michael. Thank you so much. Thank you for setting the stage, right? For providing the groundwork and the grounding for this conversation. And Jenny, we've got to pay you extra or something because you keep talking about this CARES agenda. So let's get into the CARES agenda. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alex, so she can give us a high-level deep dive into the community agendas that they work so closely with the young people to develop. Alex?
Thanks, Liz. So as we've mentioned, we started our work together with the CARES ambassadors by identifying a few key areas of policy that were important for young people and where they saw clear gaps. And one of these areas was housing, right? That's what we're here talking about today. Together, we created a national agenda with policy recommendations to specifically address the housing needs of young people. In this national agenda, the policies that we believe will improve and get us to a place of accessing safe and affordable housing. We believe that to ensure housing is accessible and affordable for everyone, and specifically, for young people, we must first preserve and expand the supply of healthy, permanent, and affordable housing. Second, help people cover the cost of healthy housing in safe and thriving neighborhoods. And finally, remove barriers that exclude young people from accessing housing and those that exploit young people with lower incomes. So we're going to drop in the chat here a link to our policy agenda. There are more details on all of these policies there. But from there, when we created this national policy agenda, we at CSSP had conversations with the CARES ambassadors, and those in Los Angeles and New York both identified housing as the area where they wanted to dig deeper and look for solutions within their own community. So we worked closely with Elizabeth, Kayonda, and other ambassadors in these two communities to create housing agendas specifically for their communities. With this, here we've got just a high level overview of this process. It was about bringing ambassadors together, doing some work together in person to identify these gaps, refining the agendas, and then more working group meetings together to workshop the agendas. Were these the right policies? What did we really need to do to make sure that these policies were responsive to the challenges that young people were saying? Elizabeth, let me just pause and see if there's anything that you want to add specifically about this process from your perspective as an ambassador.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Alice. So we first took an initiative to gather comprehensive information from our community, conducting an analysis, complemented by in-depth research and engaging in conversations. Next, we identified the priority issues for each community. Then we follow with our ambassadors who played a crucial role in addressing gaps in this agenda, ensuring nothing was overlooked. We dedicated ourselves to refining the agenda further and organized in-person meetings to workshop them effectively. With the agenda being finalized, we proudly shared the agenda with stakeholders and other parties for valuable input. Lastly, we communicated the feedback we received from our ambassadors and finalized the process with clarity and purpose. So that was kind of one of the process. We engaged in a lot of conversations. We continued to do a lot of research and seeing where the gaps fell within this issue that we continuously encounter. But with that, I'll pass it over to Alex to give us a little further understanding of the process.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for walking through that so clearly and so concisely, really with a lot of clarity. So I will quickly highlight the broad and give you all a broad overview of the policies in New York and Los Angeles. What you'll see here is there may be some overlaps between the two communities, but also some unique recommendations given those different contexts. So in Los Angeles, the 5 policy areas that the ambassadors identified are here on your screen. So the first was to ensure current housing programs and services are augmented to meet the needs of young people. And the harsh cliff of number 2 is ending the harsh cliff effect of current time-limited housing supports for young people aging out of care. The third is removing barriers that exclude young people from accessing quality housing and exploit young people with low incomes. Fourth is ensuring young people who experience foster care have housing supports that address their needs. And the fifth is ensuring systems and programs are accountable for meeting the housing needs of young people. In New York, the 4 items here, the first was really around creating a citywide network of one-stop housing centers that are specifically designed to help young people achieve their housing goals and connect them to housing resources. Second is removing barriers that exclude young people from accessing quality housing and exploit young people with lower incomes. Third is around improving housing vouchers so they are sufficient, reliable, and transferable outside of New York City. So we heard a little bit about what is and isn't possible with voucher affordability. And then finally, ensuring the accountability for meeting the housing needs of young people. I want to just note as I reflect on these 2 local agendas and the work with young people is this isn't just about young people who are connected to child welfare systems. This is about all transition aged young people who are experiencing challenges, those who may have experienced juvenile justice involvement, those that are homeless, and those that are low income, and really thinking about what are holistic solutions that meet the needs of this population. So I want to turn it back now to Elizabeth and Kayonda. And I'll start with you, Elizabeth. What policy or policies in the agenda, in the Los Angeles agenda, resonate for you? What in the agenda stands out as a policy need and a solution we need to advance?
I would say that one of the policy recommendations that kind of stands out a lot to me, especially being a young adult, a mother, and a student, and facing a lot of crisis within housing, especially being in college. I feel like I should be able to have affordable access to housing. I feel like juggling between a job and something that I found myself really just kind of having to discuss with myself was either continue with education or put education behind my back and then continue working to be able to support my family, my young son with his education and just having the stability that he deserves. Unfortunately, my young son experienced foster care with me. And so he experienced the instability that we've encountered many times, from having to switch locations, from having to look for housing, for someone to give us that opportunity. So that what one policy recommendation for me would be to remove barriers that exclude young people and families from accessing quality housing and those that exploit young people with lower incomes. And with that, I'll pass it to Kayonda so she can go ahead and add.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So yeah, just to build on what Elizabeth said, I would remove that barrier also because I just feel like it took me 2 years to like get an apartment, and I'm grateful for, for what I got, but I did have to settle because, they was gonna take away my voucher because I didn't have the proper information and proper documents that they wanted at a certain time. I just feel like if you're transitioning out of foster care, it should also be like a life coach or somebody or a point person to help you navigate to get the help that you need. Because if I have no knowledge of how to access housing, like what am I doing? Like you have to go to public assistance to get help. You have to find all these resources on your own. Like it's really, really hard. So I think like if they remove these barriers, it makes it easier on you to figure it out. Like if they're not going to provide us with the right people or the right resources, at least they can do is like remove all the hardships that it's taking for us to get this housing.
Thanks, Kayonda. And you really were able to hit on 2 in 1 there, right? Removing the barriers and also the citywide network of one-stop shops. I like what you did there. I asked for 1 and you gave us 2. So let me turn it to the partners. As you reflect on the New York and Los Angeles agendas that we've walked through, what do you see as the opportunity in policy? Is there a policy window or an opportunity now to advance one or more of these recommendations in these agendas? And Michael, why don't we start with you?
I think he may be having trouble.
I think maybe he's having trouble on mute. So Jenny, let's go to you.
Well, I think there's a lot of exciting things going on in New York City and Los Angeles that kind of bode well for taking a lot of what you guys have recommended and really kind of putting them into practice. I think and Kayonda, I love your thoughts on this in terms of New York City and the Fair Futures program, which provides coaching and other supports for young people for a good amount of time. I think is at age 14 to 26. And so it's not just about housing. It kind of builds on what you guys talked about in terms of having connection to a lot of other community-based supports, and also again thinking about your future and how housing fits into supporting like kind of where you see yourself going. And so could definitely see kind of building on that. It is really consistent with kind of a one-stop kind of housing center, and also just this idea that the young person is really leading the direction of the planning, whether it's housing or other parts of like a plan, and that that program is really there to have coaches and other supports to help you kind of find the tools and the resources. And then I also think in LA, there is a lot of work both to make FYI, and I agree, some great questions in the chat and in the Q&A about like FYI is by no means the solution. I think one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of focus on it and work on it is because it's a very important resource, and it's actually a resource that's being underutilized. So I think there's just this urgency of saying like, this is a housing resource we all have available. Most of our communities are underutilizing what's available. How do we maximize those vouchers, and then how do we make them work for young people? How do we address a lot of the challenges you guys mentioned? Because it's not just about getting the voucher, it's about being able to use it, being able to maintain the unit, and then again thinking about what's next for that young person. So I see a lot of opportunity in both those jurisdictions. And definitely, again, we're seeing some really exciting things in the chat about the work that's being done. So I think this report provides, again, you guys focus on like actionable policies, that this really does feel like the time to put them in place and then build even more.
Thanks, Jenny.
I can go next. Apologize. Like again, I am having some trouble. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I think just echoing what Jenny had already mentioned. I think for me, really like looking, New York and LA have different housing market conditions, especially when you talk about young people, right? And in New York, having lived there, it's a tri-state area. So thinking about like, okay, if you actually lived in New Jersey, what does that look like to be able to come in and work or do, like do things in New York itself, or vice versa. The same, look, if you're in Connecticut, right? Like these are not far-fetched. Like it's a common occurrence where people live outside of the city because they can't afford living in the city. I think for me, just thinking about what Jenny was saying, I think there's this question of like, what's next, right? And always keeping in mind, like, what data can we share? What data could be available to continue propelling and pushing these policy recommendations and hold communities accountable? I think that's like a big question as well that we should be keeping in mind as we move forward with this agenda. It's always helpful to hear directly from young people, and I really appreciate like both the recommendations, both made by both these groups. But I think it also, some of this or many of this is also like a long-term project, and the challenge there is like, how do we, again, going back to my earlier point, how do we keep the momentum going? Because political will and like resources, they ebb and flow, and I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to change the narrative, especially when we're working with young people and addressing their housing needs. So and I think like the substantive policy is just like the tip of the iceberg, right? And I think we're all sitting here talking about policy, but again, that's not the reality for many young people living on living in these communities, right? Like for them, it's just I'm just trying to survive, I'm just trying to hustle, I'm just trying to get to work, I'm just trying to thrive, and so really finding ways to support that type of advocacy, because it's easier said than done. Just like, yes, we are hearing from young people, but it's actually there's a lot to unpack there as well, and how we actually uplift and center people with lived experience. And I don't think we have the time to talk about that today, but that's something that I would like continue to uplift, because I think as much as like there's the policy, which I think is policy recommendations made by these groups, but we also need to think about like how can we support them in advancing this and making this sustainable and making it a reality, because it's not like a one-time, one-off conversation or transaction that we need to be doing with lawmakers. Oftentimes it's multiple years. And so thinking about that as well ahead, so that we're not left on the lurch when, like a few years from now, it's like, yeah, like, like the momentum has died. Where and really thinking about like some measurable progress and measures of accountability as we look at some of these recommendations and how communities are addressing them.
Yeah, I think, Michael, you've also given us our topic for our third discussion that we need to clearly schedule here around accountability and engagement here. Cara, as you look at these agendas and see opportunities within these agendas as a policy window and opportunities, what do you see as policy windows? Where are the opportunities? And how do we get policymakers to pick up and really move this in their agendas as well?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I think I touched upon it briefly earlier, but I think, and it's on my mind because Congress is going to be negotiating tax reform, right, in the new year. And so, what are some ways that we could get rental assistance in the form of cash, right, to young people? That is not a cure-all. I think, that needs to be accompanied with all of the resources that are talked about, and help in navigating the system, right, and making sure that housing is safe and help with security deposits, right, or credit, or, whatever is needed. But, to make it truly affordable, I think it's clear, right, that more assistance is needed. And so, I know in the American Rescue Plan Act, right, there was help in lowering the age that a young person could access the earned income tax credit, right? And that was particularly for youth who had experience in foster care or youth experiencing homelessness, right? I think that is something that should be re-upped, and that is money, right, that young people could use towards housing. As well as this idea of could we pilot, a renter tax credit, right? Or, look to these other models that are happening around the country of guaranteed income, right? And how they could work for young people. Again, I don't want to say that's a panacea for everything, but I think it could help. And, the vehicle that's going to be moving, right, policy wise is, one of them is tax. And so what can we, what kind of resources can we secure for young people on that? And then, I am hopeful that next year, depending on, a few different things, that, there will be an increased interest in housing and moving some policy on housing. And I think, I know at First Focus, we look at ways that we could make sure to that children and youth are prioritized, right? And that their voices are prioritized. So what kind of government structures can we put in place so that if a bill passes for implementation, right, the bill, that folks have to, whether it's, federal departments have to talk to young people to, to help with implementation, right? What are ways that, we could create those entities that are more permanent, so we make sure that input and that prioritization of children and youth is constant. And so I think, in thinking through, what's ways through the appropriations process, right? There's ways that maybe, we could, be asking HUD for more flexibility, right, for some of these things. And so I think there's tweaks in advocacy that can happen and build off of the agenda that you put out, on a national level that can then filter down.
Thanks so much, Cara. I really appreciate your response, and that was it really ties us into some of the questions that we're seeing come through in the Q&A. So transitioning to some of those questions in the Q&A, one question that we've gotten here is around what other housing options could or should complement vouchers when we think about ensuring housing diversity? And I appreciate your comments around cash and leveraging the upcoming tax opportunity here as well, right? Holistically, when we think about supporting young people in their housing, in accessing safe, affordable housing, what other housing options should we be looking at?
Alex, do you want me to kick us off?
You go for it.
Okay.
Go for it, Jenny. I feel like it's on the tip of your tongue, Jenny.
Well, and I think, again, this is kind of what the CARES process shows. I mean, I think jurisdictions do need to look at both their youth population and also hear from those young people and then build out a continuum. I mean, I think we use data for a lot of things. Unfortunately, I don't think we use data enough where it concerns older youth and young adults in the child welfare system. I mean, you can look at your child welfare population, you can't tell everything, but based on like placement and other things, you can tell something that gives you a sense of like what are the needs and what should your continuum look like. And then of course you need, though, that needs to be informed by young people, because a lot of those things, the data you're seeing, those records, they don't tell the whole story. And I think we can definitely, like, you know, share kind of different examples, but they're kind of going to be the same examples when you think about like what a young adult needs. So I think, you know, for housing options, we are thinking about, you know, some of those options need to be thinking about reconnecting or strengthening familial connections. Many of us, it is, again, absolutely like a norm or a high number of youth across the population live or kind of live with their parents well into their 20s. Like that's a reality that a good number of the population need to do, because again, they're not at the place yet where they can necessarily independently afford housing. And that's not going to be the situation for everyone, but certainly, at least I think we've heard feedback from youth that the system doesn't do enough as youth are getting older to either reconnect them or strengthen those connections so that housing through family is more of a viable option. And I think that's needs to be thought about as part of our housing continuum. But then I think you do think about, like everyone's talked about, a range of options. Some young people, like coming from the system, just like other young people, might need more support for a longer period of time. So you would think of something that was a more long-term rental subsidy with services. Some young people really just need a subsidy, and maybe it graduates down over time. And I think there's also a lot of innovative things we're hearing more about, like intergenerational housing complexes, which I think, you know, could be of interest again to all young people, but thinking about a young person coming out of foster care, it might again be, but we're seeing it again across the spectrum, the benefits of having that intergenerational support. And I'm sure there's tons of more examples that everyone on the panel could give. And I think it is a matter of kind of really trying to do as much analysis as you can. And I know we got in the chat or the Q&A that sometimes it's hard to get that data. And I think, you know, there are some places that have been very good about collecting that data. There's also some jurisdictions that have external researchers who are making it their business to help collect that data so we can use it. I think there's always some data to start from. Again, it's not going to tell the whole story, and you do need to engage youth to fill out that picture. But I think it is about planning a continuum and then figuring out how to fund it. And I'm not saying that's easy, but it just seems like that's how you kind of want to start and look at it. What are the diverse needs, and what are the different ways we can fill them?
Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. Anybody else want to add into that in their responses?
Can you just repeat the question again, Alex, just to make sure?
So yeah, nope, thank you. So when we think about housing options, and what can complement vouchers, right? When we think about a broad spectrum of ways to support housing, Cara mentioned, right? Some of it is around cash to families. Jenny's laying out a picture for, right, some young people aging out. They need cash. They need a subsidy to support them. Others need more supportive, longer term housing. So there's really a broad range of ways we need to be thinking about this. As Elizabeth mentioned too, right? Young people are not only part of their families where they come from, but they have their own families. And we need to be really thinking about young people as families as well here. So if there's anything else, Michael, that you'd like to add, would love to hear it.
I mean, this is piggybacking from what Jenny and but also what Care had touched on earlier about the renter tax credits, right? Like that's actually one of the small things or a few things that I've been working on within Results Educational Fund. My work at Results is pushing for a renter tax credit that would benefit a lot of low-income households, taxpayers, and renters. And that's really acknowledging this reality that people on like limited income, that's just not enough. Whether you're getting SSI, SSDI, or other state housing subsidy, those are not enough. And we're looking at different systems, different levers that, again, that doesn't just focus on housing itself, right? So this is actually going beyond what HUD is providing, what the Department of U.S. Housing and Urban Development is providing in terms of housing supports and assistance. We're looking at like, how can we leverage the tax code to make it more fair, more equitable for young people, and thinking about this need, like some of you had mentioned earlier, right? Like sometimes people need more support and housing support and services. Others just need that subsidy and then they call it a day. And I think the tax code is primed for that, right? Like some of these people are already working. They're part of the workforce. They're paying taxes in some shape or form, whether that's state, local, or on the federal level. And so how can we leverage these other systems? And the tax system is just but one, right? Cara was saying that there will be a lot of tax policy debate next year in Congress as lawmakers debate the expiring provisions within the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So how, I think the question for this group is like, how can you advance your agenda within that conversation, right? And I think there's a lot to unpack there and really uplift the housing needs of young people in the context of tax policy. And I think there's a lot of intersections there. We don't have to get into that now, but there's also like these other systems, right? Healthcare system. How is that being leveraged to address the needs, the housing needs of young people? There's like Medicaid waivers that have been used to provide housing support, whether that's like rental assistance, right? And so that's another way to look at this. And then there's also, and I think this is already ongoing work for a lot of the juvenile justice and criminal justice reform advocates. How can we prevent them from coming into contact with these justice systems where the only purpose is to penalize them and trap them further into poverty, right? And then there's also, again, like, what do we do once if you come into contact with the juvenile justice or the criminal justice system? What happens when you get out of that system, right? There's also a lot of support needed there. There's a lot of what we call collateral consequences, right? These are consequences that you encounter because you came into contact with the criminal justice system. You had a criminal record, you were arrested, right? And how does that impact like your ability to find and secure housing or stay stably housed?
Yeah, thank you. We heard a lot when we were engaging with Elizabeth and Kayonda. The other ambassadors lifted it up. As Elizabeth mentioned, we did a whole lot of qualitative research and heard a lot from those young people around the intersection, right? And young people are touching multiple systems. And so then what does that look like? What are those barriers that it creates also? So go ahead, Michael. And then
can I just add one more? I think it's great that this group is also looking at data. And just as a pro tip, I work with aides on the Hill and Congress. Data, there's a lot of data, and there's also need for more data, but don't discount or undersell the importance of telling your own story. And it doesn't have to be all about like poverty porn where the sappier it is, the better it is. I think the goal is really to provide a more nuanced picture of the housing needs of young people. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I have this X, Y, and Z struggles. It could just be like an X struggle or a Y struggle or a Z struggle. And that's okay. Your stories matter. And that's part of like shifting this narrative. We talk about like shifting the narrative whether on the federal, state, or local level. And again, there's a lot of data. Use that to your advantage. But like really, when you work and talk to lawmakers and policymakers, they care about the stories because it's the stories that help bridge that connection, that build that relationship, not just a short term, but also long term. And again, it doesn't have to be like, super sappy. It could be a simple thing that puts adds more nuance and shade to what the reality is of young people and their housing needs. So I just want to uplift that because I don't want to lose that in the conversation around policy, data points. I think stories are equally, if not more powerful in changing the minds, because we know in this room, people who are listening, we know what the right policies are. We know what the proper interventions are. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right, in the first place. But the challenge is like, how do we convince those people who are not yet educated, who are in disagreement with some of the needs of the housing needs of young people? That's also a challenge. It's, don't lose sight of we have the policy recommendations, but also like, how do you actually get more people on board, supportive, and pushing for this agenda?
Thanks so much, Michael. I think one thing I'm really walking away from today with our conversation is the creativity that exists out there and how we push ourselves, how we push policymakers to think about what we can do differently. We don't have to be stuck inside of the current structure. We can really start to think differently about how we're supporting young people. And young people are part of that, driving us and pushing us around the creative solutions. Well, why does it have to work like that? Let's think about this differently. So before we close out, I want to just end with hearing just one thing from Elizabeth and Kayonda around what's one thing you're taking away from today's conversation? What's one thing you want to make sure we take away, that folks on the phone and this webinar take away from today's conversation? I want to give the mic to you all for a last moment, and then Liz.
For me, I'm just really happy because I see how like encouraging and how what's the word? I'm sorry, I'm just so overjoyed. But it's so important, and I see that like y'all pushing for change, and it's really appreciated because I fear for the youth like that's coming up and transitioning out of care, and how hard it's gonna be for them. But I see like from now we're trying to do better and we're working on it. So it takes a village, and I'm happy that we're gonna keep doing this. So this was like a good panel, and I'm happy. I'm happy for the audience. I'm happy for the participants. I'm just overjoyed. Thank you.
Yeah, kind of to go off with what Kayonda was saying, I'm really grateful to be part of conversations and future conversations regarding this issue that we continuously encounter, and hearing from young people, ourselves, I'm already past the age of, I'm a former foster youth, but the fact that we're still continuously seeing these issues and still being able to stay in the table and kind of just come together and kind of collectively work together to finding key support for our community. But I would say my call to action is to actively learn from each other, strain our existing relationships, and forge new partnerships with CARES and CSSP. Together, we can unite as a powerful community. While there is an abundant amount of resources available, it is essential to enhance our connections and knowledge. Let's make the most of what's out there and help young people and young families to a cycle of stability. So as I said before, I'm a young parent, and showing that stability to my son has been very important. And being able to have access to safe housing has always something that we encounter, that we currently hear all the time, is just, as long as I have housing, I can go out and get mental health support. I can go find a job. I can continue with my education. I can continue to help my community in the ways that I found resources, because I know that there's a lot of lack of connection between social worker, resources, community. It's just, there is resources out there. But I would just say coming together will be one of the big factors that I continuously see. Just coming together and helping each other, hey, filling the gaps. But yeah.
Wow. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's always extremely hard to come after young people who have their stuff together like Elizabeth and Kayonda. So I won't add more, but But I will say a special thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Alex, for the facilitation. And thank you for your thoughtful responses in the chat and the questions in the chat. Thank you, Leonard Burton, our president and CEO. These kind of conversations need to continue. And I just want to remind you that CARES is not about making incremental improvements to existing systems, but about radically reimagining how society supports these young people. We want a future where young people's ideas and freedoms are at the forefront of policy and practice. If you want to stay connected with CARES and get involved in our work, please visit our website and follow us on social media. We'd love to have you join us. Let's continue, as Elizabeth said, the collaboration and conversation that we began today. The links to the national and community agendas are in the chat, and we'll have the webinar recording available soon. Thank you all again. Thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.